The encyclical, Pope Francis' encyclical on the environment was, and still is, very unusual for several reasons. In part because it was one of the most anticipated encyclicals that we've ever had. I'm just checking my time to make sure I don't go over. I'm not finished yet. It's it was unusual in that people were very much interested in what he had to say over a year in advance. Even before the encyclical was released, I had given 8 talks on people were asking me to talk on what was possibly going to be in the encyclical. Not what was in the encyclical or about the encyclical, but to actually give 8 talks about what was going to be in the encyclical. And what was interesting is, while 2 of those talks were to faith communities, 6 were not. Now that's particularly unusual for a papal encyclical. It's also unusual. I was being interviewed by Suhanna Marchand on CBC's News World, their 24-hour news TV show thingy, and she was asking me about the encyclical and what was an encyclical, and I was explaining how important they are, and that the fact that this was an encyclical means that in the hierarchy of Roman Catholic documents, this is really important. It's not like a luncheon speech where you can sort of take it or leave it. But this is an encyclical, which means Roman Catholics really are obliged to listen to it, pay attention to it. It's instruction that we're supposed to listen to and try to follow. And she said, so you Roman Catholics read these encyclicals and study them? And I said, no, of course not. Because they're unreadable. Most of them are quite unreadable. What's unique about this one, it's very conversational. It's as if an uncle is speaking to, his children or nephews or nieces or whatever that relationship is. And so it makes it accessible, and it's extremely widely read. It's really unusual for bookstores to be out of an encyclical. Try and get a copy of this encyclical at any bookstore in Toronto right now. You won't. They won't say we don't carry it. They will say it's out of stock. And that's extremely unusual for an encyclical. It's a bit lengthy, 184 pages. Pope Francis tends to really write long encyclicals. But it was so widely or highly anticipated and widely consulted. Now, even though it's 184 pages, I'm going to try and summarize the content of the encyclical and really speak about what does it challenge us? How does it challenge us? In other words, what's new in here? What's being emphasized in here? What is it that the Pope wants us to hear? And what is it that he wants us to do? And so I'm going to focus on just 6 ideas. There are many more in there, but I'm going to choose 6 that I think will give you a good sense of what the encyclical is about and what we are being called to do. The 6 ideas are that, I'll just go through them quickly. One is that there is an intercommunion among the divine, the human, and the rest of creation. There's this triangular relationship. And this relationship defines how we are in the rest of creation. And I'll speak more about each one of these points. Secondly, that humans are part of creation, not separate from it, which sounds obvious, but it's not. Thirdly, that everything in the universe has intrinsic value, not just humans. Fourthly, that overconsumption is a primary cause of climate change. Fifthly, that we need a radical change of our culture. We need to reinvent the human. And finally, that political and economic leaders simply have not done enough. That the response to the environmental crisis has been woefully inadequate. So let's take each of these points individually. The intercommunion among the divine, the human, and the rest of creation. This is not new in the Christian tradition. I mean, we've understood this, but we lost sight of it. After the Enlightenment period, it came down to a relationship primarily between the individual and God, and the individual and some humans. because some humans were more important than others. Indeed, some humans weren't even humans. So it was a divine human and a somewhat constrained relationship between humans and other humans. We lost the sense of the social dimension of the human, but we especially lost the sense of the human relationship to the rest of creation. And what Francis says about this is really interesting. So he says that this loss of relationship can be understood outwardly, but also inwardly. He acknowledges that when we lose a sense of the magnificence and beauty of creation, we lose a sense of the magnificence and beauty of ourselves as well. That to the extent we live in an impoverished environment, we are impoverished. And we know this intuitively. If we stand before a beautiful meadow, we are inspired. When we are feeling stressed, we don't say, let me go to Young and Bloor and meditate. We want to go beside a brook or into a meadow or beside a mountain or whatever to relax and to take in that beauty and feel refreshed. And even if we stand before a disaster like a natural disaster like a forest fire that has devastated a forest, we can recognize that devastation, but very quickly we start to see it recover. And we can celebrate that recovery so that even in that bleakness, we see life. Or even if we go into a desert, we can see a certain beauty in the desert. Yes, it's different than the meadow, but it has its own intrinsic beauty. But when we stand before land that has been devastated by humans, like the reduction of mountains because we want to do mining, or what we do on the tar sands, when we see this, this touches us deeply inside. There is a mourning at this loss. We have lost a sense of our own identity because we know intuitively that we are in relationship with the rest of that, and the other with whom we are in a relationship has been devastated. And more than that, it has been devastated by us. This in some way is original sin all over again, where we presume to take the place of God and decide how creation should be treated, and we fail to acknowledge our own creaturely limitations. So this intercommunion among the divine, the human, and the rest of creation is one of the notions that Francis feels we need to recover if we're going to have an effective response to the ecological crisis. Secondly, he focuses on the notion that humans are part of creation, not separate from it. If you look at why did we get into this ecological crisis in the first place, one of the reasons is that we saw ourselves as separate from everything else. We're a subject, everything else is object. If we're going to pollute, so long as the pollution is over there, it doesn't matter because it doesn't touch me. I'm separate from the rest of creation, and that rest of creation, by the way, includes people who are not important to me as well as land. And we also lost a sense of the sacredness of creation. When something is sacred, you treat it with respect, you value it. Nobody goes into a church and decides to break into a hockey game. You behave in a certain way because indeed it is a church, and it merits our respect. And we want to treat it as a place where dignity is called for. This sense that humans are part of creation, not separate from it, reveals a very interesting point about the way Francis thinks. Since the time of Copernicus, humans have learned that the Earth is not the center of the universe. For about 2,000 years, we thought Earth was the center of the universe, and that the moon went around it, and the sun and 5 planets, because in those days there were only 5 planets. And they all moved around in perfect circles, and well, okay, that's it. That was basically the universe. Oh yes, there was a firmament of heaven, and there were these little holes in it where the light of heaven shined through, which, we recognize them as stars, but they were just little rents in the firmament of heaven. But that was the universe. Even 100 years ago, we thought there was only one galaxy. Now we realize that there are billions of galaxies with billions of star systems in each of those galaxies. We have a much different idea. However, even though, since the time of Copernicus, We no longer think that the Earth is the center of the universe. In many ways, we still think that. We still act as if it is. So when we thought that the Earth was the center of the universe, we saw the human as the most important creature on Earth as the center of the universe. So we were subjects, everything else was objects. We had value, everything else had value to the extent that it was valuable to us. We had a spiritual dimension. Nothing else had a spiritual dimension. Spirit was isolated enough, and everything else was just non-spirit filled matter. It was just matter. It had no spirit value whatsoever. So when we realized after Copernicus that the Earth indeed wasn't the center of the universe, you would think that our thinking would start to shift. But we still act as if we lived in a pre-Copernican universe. And although since 1950, popes have said we can accept an evolutionary understanding of the universe with some limitations, but we can accept that this is an evolutionary universe, we still act and write and in many ways think as if we lived in a pre-Copernican universe. But not Francis. Francis talks about us as being part of creation, as emerging from creation. So he has us in an integral relationship with creation, not above creation, not having dominion over creation, but working with creation, taking care of it, to serve it and protect it. He's the first pope who really has a sense of that we have emerged from an evolutionary universe, that we are integrally connected with the rest of creation. This is a dramatic shift in theological anthropology. For 2,000 years, we have written about the human as if we were above everything else, that we were the center of the universe. This is the first pope who starts to write about us as coming out of that universe process. Let me put it to you another way. This isn't something Pope Francis does as an encyclical, but it's something that I like to do to give people a sense of this connectivity. The universe is about 13.8 billion years old. So we're going to round that up to 14 billion years because it's an easier number to work with. And if you were going to write the history of the universe so that 1 million years was on each page of recording that history, and you were going to put 500 pages in each volume, then it would take 28 volumes to record the whole history of the universe. 28 volumes. 500 pages, 500 pages in each volume, 28 volumes, that would record the 14 billion years of universe history. So Earth would show up in volume 19, and the first primitive life form on Earth would show up in volume 21. Now, do you know where the most primitive humans would show up? Any guesses? All right, what volume? Let's start with volume. What volume?
Homo sapien?
Yeah, well, not 27, even later than 27, so that could only be 28. All right, what page? Now, we're talking about really primitive humans here. Well, they're actually 498. What we would call human civilization would be about the last two words on page 500 of volume 28. We like to think this whole story is about us, but there's all these other volumes that are out there that are all part of this development of this story. To get to this minute, you have to go through all those volumes. Okay? So Francis realizes that to get to the human story, you have to go through those 28 volumes to get to this minute, because that is what brings about the human. We are an integral part of that universe. When he talks about an integral ecology, that's what he's talking about. He speaks about it in very poetic words, and I just want to quote two of his statements on this. So he says, as part of the universe, called into being by one creator, all of us, and this is all of creation, are linked by unseen bonds and together form a kind of universal family, a sublime communication which fills us with a sacred, affectionate, and humble respect. So we have this sense that to get to the human, We had 28 volumes of unfolding story to get to this very moment. But it's not all about us, because there's all these other volumes that are great storylines, have a lot of character development, plot development, that isn't even thinking about the human. He goes on and he says, God has joined us so closely to the world around us that we can feel the desertification of the soil almost as a physical ailment, and the extinction of a species as a painful disfigurement cry of the poor and the cry of the earth. We are so closely connected to the rest of creation that harm to creation is so intimately felt by us. And as a result of that, when we talk about ecological justice, we cannot do so unless we talk about social justice. Because most ecological problems have a social component to them. Ecological problems harm people. And the harm we do to people invariably is harming the environment as well. Because when we're harming people, we're often treating them as mere objects. And that kind of attitude usually hurts the planet as well. He talks about how our behavior, particularly in the developed West, has caused ecological debt. We talk about economic debt with the developing world, and in fact, we often use that economic debt in order to gain control over them. If you want help from the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, then you will reduce your social programs, you will do all of these things, and then we will help you with your economic debt. So we use economic debt to gain control over the poor. But he says the developing world has created an ecological debt with the planet and with the developing world. We have, through our industrialization, has consumed more than our fair share of the atmospheric commons. In fact, we used up our share and the share of the developing world. So we have created an ecological debt with them. Why can't they use our ecological debt in order to control us? And say, maybe just as you're trying to control us through economic debt, you now owe us through your ecological debt. So that you need to share the benefit of that technology. You need to help us develop sustainable ways of being so that we can go into the future without going through the same kind of heavy industrialization that you have. When Francis talks about the intrinsic value of each creature, he reminds us that the purpose of other creatures isn't all about us. You know, insects romped around the planet and did insect things, and plants go along the planet and do plant things for billions of years without humans showing up. You know, the early phytoplankton were oxygenating the planet quite happily, and they had no concern for humans. And so their value isn't dependent upon us. We often see the value of creatures through our needs. And to the extent that they are not useful to us, they are not useful. And we need to remember, Francis reminds us, that they have intrinsic value in and of themselves. They too are part of a salvation history. That salvation history for them doesn't depend on us. It simply is part of their creation story. The fourth point is that overconsumption is a primary cause of climate change. He says that we have developed a throwaway culture. That we have lost sense of how we need to limit our levels of consumption. That it's important for us to take care of our wants, or our needs, but we do not have to be so excessively focused on our wants. You can tell it's early in the academic year. My voice hasn't gotten used to all the lecturing yet. So our overconsumption has utilized more than our fair share of the planet's resources. And he's calling on us to turn towards renewable resources, to use non-renewable resources less, and to the extent that we're using them, to use them more efficiently, to focus on reusing and recycling them. It's basic ecological care for the planet. He recognizes that what the West is being called to is a serious change of culture. We cannot deal with the magnitude of the ecological crisis by simply tinkering with our behavior. We have to radically change how we understand the human, not as separate from everything else, but as integrated with everything else. That social justice will not be effective if it is also not considering economic, political, and ecological justice as well. This is a rethinking of who we are and how we behave and the values that we hold to. This is going to take a great deal of change. And he makes an interesting point about this. We will need science to make this kind of a change. There's no doubt about it. We will need the cooperation of science. Yes, some scientific adventures got us into this mess, but we will not get out of the mess without them. But at the same time, we also need religions. Why? Because data alone will not sufficiently motivate people to the magnitude of the change that is needed. This is what religions are about. Religions are about conversion, about changing who we are, returning to the right path, getting away from the wrong path and reimagining ourselves, doing radical changes, doing a 180-degree turn. Data alone does not support change on this scale. If it did, the 1972 report of Rome, from the Club of Rome, would have been sufficient. It gave us all the scientific data that we needed. But that didn't bring about change. Scientific reports are necessary to guide us as to what we must do, but they do not motivate the level of change that's needed. Religion is about falling in love again with God, with creation, and with the rest of humanity. And that's what we need to be doing if we're going to reinvent the human and take on the magnitude of the problem that faces us. We need religion to guide us. It's interesting that in the encyclical, he not only references Roman Catholic sources, but also Orthodox sources and non-Christian sources as well. We need the world's religions to speak to the hearts of people, not just the minds of people, but the hearts of people, because speaking to the hearts gives you the motivation that will sustain the long and difficult changes that we need to make. So a radical change of culture is a difficult task, but it is one that we can do, because indeed that's what religions are about, radical change. And finally, he says that our political and economic leaders have not done enough. And he's right. It's amazing that we have the COP meetings, we have the climate change meetings every year. We had Rio, and then we revisited Rio. We have another meeting coming up in Paris. We have these meetings, and very little comes out of them. The Canadian record at these meetings is appalling. That's not part of the encyclical, I'm just throwing. In fact, he's very gracious. He does throw a bone to us. He refers to actually a very fine document from the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, and he quotes from it. He actually quotes from many of the bishop statements around the world, demonstrating the collegiality that he talks about, but I digress. Canada sucks when it comes to climate change. We have been obstructionists. In terms of the amount of greenhouse gases produced per capita, we are always in a race with usually Australia and the United States is to see who's going to be worse, and it's usually between us and Australia. The United States is doing much better, and so they have fallen out of that race. We are usually the world leaders or the world's laggards when it comes to climate change. And so he's pointing to a lack of political and economic leadership on these matters. And I think he's absolutely right. That's why he insisted that this encyclical had to come out in this summer. Because he wanted it to come out before he spoke to the United Nations this past week. And he wanted it to come out before he spoke to both houses of the United States government this week. And he wanted it to come out before the talks in Paris in late November, early December this year. He wants us to be part of that conversation. We need to be part of that conversation, and we need to make changes now because the urgency of the problem is so great. And as he says, if we don't respond to this problem from our hearts, and from our, not just our minds, but from our hearts, then we're not going to be successful.